I'm an associate professor in gender, women's, and sexuality studies, and then also in the School of Art and Art History. And I've been at the university, this will be my 22nd year. So I started when I was like 4 years old, and I love it. It's been an amazing experience. So today I've got 2 books out, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those books and kind of about my work as an artist. There's sort of 4 things that inspire me to make work and to think and do research. And those are stories, obviously different people's stories, social issues, narrative and illustrative modes of storytelling. So basically stories, good stories with good images. And then history. And history is one of those things I never knew I liked history until I was much older. And then I was like, wow, this is phenomenal. And so, I attribute that to really good writers. So I want to start off with this quote. This is one of my favorite writers about art, Susie Gablick, and she writes that vision is not defined by the disembodied eye, as we have been trained to believe. Vision is a social practice that is rooted in the whole being. And I share that as an artist just because I think, art is about so much more than observation. It's really about what we see, how our bodies become filters for what we see and how our experiences help us to understand the world. And so, my experience in the world is unique, just like yours. And I think it really, we all become instruments for research. So I just share this to say that this is one of my notebooks. And when I'm in meetings or I'm listening to people talk, this is how I remember things. I'm not, I can't. I'm not good if I just write things down. So I do a lot of drawing when I'm listening to people, and it's the way I learn about the world. And I started doing that as an undergraduate, taking art history classes, because I just could not get the information to stick in my head. And I found that, if I'm drawing while I'm listening to this lecture, I'm going to be able to remember this and what they said and what it means. So for me, the practice of drawing is really an important way of understanding the world. These are just more pages from my notebook. And then I'm a painter. I've been trained as a painter. That's really the first way I think about sort of interacting with ideas and stories. And so I love birds. These are some of my older pieces, and mostly I work in watercolor. I've started working again in oil the past couple of years, and doing a lot of like sitting in the woods and painting. So the first piece I'm going to talk to you about is my book about Mary Turner, and it's called Elegy for Mary Turner, an illustrated account of a lynching. And I just want to warn people ahead of time, this is kind of a hard topic. It's a hard talk. And the story is really incredibly difficult, I think, for most people to hear. So one piece of advice I would say is if you're working on a book, don't start on another book in the middle of the book you're working on. Like, put it off and come back to it. That's something I definitely learned. And so I was doing work for another project, a book about Detroit. And in that project, I came across, obviously, the work of Walter White, who has been involved or was involved with the NAACP in various roles throughout much of his career. And when he first began his career, he graduated from a university in Atlanta. Walter White passed for white, even though he was African-American. He had blonde hair, very pale skin, and blue eyes, bright blue eyes. So he first began working for the NAACP, and they caught wind of a lynching spree in South Georgia. And they said, we're going to send you down to investigate this. So, imagine a young Black man, probably in his early 20s, going to investigate a mob lynching in Southern Georgia in 1918. So he came into town and takes on the role of a traveling salesman, and basically, chats people up all over town, sort of collecting information about this. And he finds someone that took part in these lynchings, and finds out who was there, what happened, how it happened, and sort of the timeline. And he writes it up, and he sends a number of missiles, but both to the NAACP, but then the NAACP, reaches out to the governor and says, Hugh Dorsey, and says, this is terrible. Something has to be done. There must be justice. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. And in fact, the governor basically says, well, if Black communities would police themselves, we wouldn't have to do this kind of thing. Not exactly, but more or less, that's what they said. So Walter White writes up this piece, and it appears in the Crisis, and it's called The Work of a Mob, which you'll see right here. And this is really what inspired my story. And all of these things are available. There's a wonderful website. I love history, but it's so much easier when I don't have to be an academic historian. And so the Mary Turner Project actually has done an amazing job of collecting these artifacts, of documenting what happened, of, reaching out to the ancestors of Mary Turner and keeping this story alive. And so I was really fortunate. So if there's anything interesting here today that you hear, you can go to the Mary Turner Project, which is maryturner.org, and see these primary documents. The other thing that's really interesting about that story is, in Georgia, in Valdosta, which is where a lot of this takes place, there was evidently a fire. And so much of the documentation of these things that happened in terms of newspapers disappeared. And when my friend Julie Buckner Armstrong, who's the premier scholar on this event, went to do research, she could find nothing. I mean, she basically was stonewalled. And I actually had a very similar experience writing to different archives in Georgia and saying, hey, I'm interested. We don't have anything. We don't have anything. Like, how could you not have anything on this? There were newspapers all over the country picking this up at the time. So again, this is a picture of ancestors of Mary Turner, Mary and Hayes Turner, who were two people that were killed by the mob during this lynching spree. And they erected this marker right here. And I'll talk a little bit about this marker on the Little River, the banks of the Little River. And in time, I think they erected that in, I want to say maybe 2010. I'm not exactly sure. And it's been shot at. And in fact, last year it was shot at and run over by, they think, someone with a fairly significant truck. It had to be taken down. And in its place, they erected a large steel cross, which I think is a lot harder to shoot at and also a little bit sturdier to run into. But, you can tell this has still been incredibly controversial in this area. And I'm sure descendants of the people that participated in this mob, you can see their names all over town, are still in the area. And obviously they're not responsible for what happened in the past. None of us are, but it's important to recognize that they've benefited in many ways from the fear that it evoked. So I want to share this. This is a map of lynchings from 1900 to 1931. And this was sort of a collection created by the Tuskegee Institute. Now, obviously, these are documented lynchings. So there's a lot of lynchings that were undocumented, where, names of people are not known. The details are pretty shady. But if you look, this is sort of where my research was taking place in this part of the country. And so here's the panhandle of Florida, and you've got Georgia here, and of course, South Carolina. And you can see that Georgia is there's a lot of lynchings in Georgia, and also, that follow the Mississippi, which is kind of interesting. And also in Florida, people forget that Florida was actually a very racist place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about lynchings. This is a photograph of a lynching from 1935. And what's interesting is that there were a lot of people documenting lynchings for all kinds of reasons. There were postcards created, people would take souvenirs, and it was an event. These were public, very, very public events. As you can see, here, this little girl's dressed up. There's probably her dad in a boater, white pants, has come to see this. And I cannot imagine, taking a child that age to see such a gruesome spectacle. So this is how most lynchings go. This is kind of the general story. There's a wrong, or rumor of a wrong is spread in a community that's predominantly white. And, a mob of people gathered, and they want to sort of take out, they want justice. They want fast justice. They're not interested in due process. And usually these wrongs involve crossing a line of some sort, most often the race line, but sometimes the sexuality line. Sometimes these things intersect where people have crossed lines related to race and also crossed lines related to sexuality. Usually the subject of the rumor is a white woman has been wronged. This is not always the case, but generally this is how this goes, or maybe a child is involved. The mob comes together seeking a person, and usually they're trying to find the person that's on the other side of this rumor. But if they can't find that person, they'll find a person who they identify, who has identifying characteristics with the person, who they believe has done this wrong. And so you see people swept up by this mob mentality of, we're going to take someone out. We're going to satisfy our bloodthirst. And the thing about lynching, it's not just about killing someone. It's also about public humiliation and brutality, and often the signs of this are left. So, these people's bodies will be on display for, days so that other folks can see it, and also to instill fear, in the target community. So often the Black community in the South. And what's so interesting, people are like, these things don't happen anymore. Why is this history important? I'm like, if you look at recent events in our country, there's a very similar sense of righteousness, of justice. There's a very clear set of divisions around what is right and what is not right. And a lot of it is rooted in white supremacy. And I think that there's a lot to be said for, how these violent things are happening and how people feel justified. If you look at those pictures, if you look at pictures of lynchings, you can clearly identify the folks that are in those pictures. But, no one takes that up. No one says, what did you see? Why were you there? How did you participate? That never comes up. So, similar, I think, it's kind of interesting, in terms of the insurrection in January, that they've used images to find out who was there and then hold those people accountable. That's actually fairly unusual when you think about these large mob, bits of violence. So I want to talk about what kind of inspired the way this book looks. So I heard this story, and at the time I was working as a doula. And Mary Turner, I'll tell you a little bit about the story. So Hampton Smith is he's a landowner. And at the time, what had happened was, this is 1918. Labor is, important in the South in terms of agriculture. There's a war, there's also the Spanish flu. And in Georgia, the boll weevil has come and really decimated the cotton crop. And so this man gets his labor through a system related to basically kind of like bail bonds. So people are mostly Black people, Black men are arrested for very minor, petty crimes. And in the local jail, they are leased out to landowners, and the landowners basically pay their bail. And then the deal is that person has to pay the landowner back. And so, of course, that happens with interest, and it's impossible to get out of that debt. So this is how this white landowner gets labor, and he's known to be incredibly brutal. His wife, one night, he and his wife are in their house. A shot is fired through the window. This is how the story goes. It pierces his wife in the chest, and the second bullet, I guess, goes through her, then kills him. And she's pregnant. So, genteel white woman, pregnant white woman on top of everything else. So, of course, he has 4 brothers, and his 4 brothers get a number of white men together, and they're mad. They want justice for the murder of this man and for, obviously, the crimes they see against his wife. And there's a lot of rumors about what happened to her. She was not raped. She was not, dragged out of her house or assaulted, but these are the rumors that go on. So you imagine how infuriating people hear a white pregnant woman has been raped and her husband was killed by a Black man. And so this mob seeks revenge. And in the course of about 10 days, they end up lynching 11 people. And one of those people is Hayes Turner, who had some affiliation with this landowner, but was not the person, obviously, that shot his wife and him. And So he's lynched, and his wife, Mary Turner, who's also pregnant, she's 8 months pregnant at the time, says, there needs to be justice. It's not right for these white men to just kill us wholesale. And she says this loudly. She's like, we know who these people are. They should be brought to court. And they come and get her. And they drive her past her husband's body. He's been lynched. And then they kill her, and they also kill her baby. And I use the term baby. I'm very much interested in reproductive justice, but this baby, is taken from her body, cries, and is killed. So at that point, you have a baby, and the baby was over 8 months. So this is the story. So this is all happening. In my mind, this story is floating around. I am working as a doula. I've had 2 children. I actually went to school at Florida State about an hour and a half south of where all of this happened. I'm incredibly familiar with Valdosta. I taught at Bainbridge College in Georgia, which is not very far away. So this story, for all kinds of reasons, really sticks in my head, and I can't get it out. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm in Washington, D.C. at the archives there, looking for various things related to this story, and also a story about Detroit, which I'll tell later. And I come across the work of Helena Bakrakova-Dietrikova, and she is, this is in the library in the Women's Art Museum in Washington. And it's a small exhibit of her wood carvings, and she did wordless graphic novels. And so she was sort of working in the vein of Lynn Ward and Franz Masereel, but her work is really, you can't really see it in this, but much of her stories are about domestic life. She's Czech, whereas their stories are often about large social issues. But I just love her work. And at the time, this clicks in my head. I'm like, oh my goodness, when I tell the story of Mary Turner, I want to do it through block prints. And so these are on linoleum. So this is a series. And when I thought about it initially, and this is not a great photograph, I'm sorry, I was thinking about diptychs and triptychs. I was not thinking about a book. And so, I did a number of pieces. These are the blocks actually in linoleum about this. And when I got them all sort of laid out, it was sort of a generic story of lynching. And I was like, this is a really particular story of lynching. I want to figure out how I can make it very, very particular. So then, I go back to Walter White's story, and I started writing these things. And so this is sort of how, and working it out into a book form. So how to tell this story, so it's sequential. And that's sort of how the book came to being. This is the marker, Mary Turner's marker. And you can't see it, but there are bullet holes in it. These are some of her relatives. The Valdosta State University bought the prints. It's really interesting. They put them on display. They said, we have to put them on display in the library where someone is there 24 hours a day, because if we put them anywhere else on campus and they aren't watched, someone's probably going to steal them or damage them. So that was pretty interesting. So at Valdosta State, I gave a talk about this, and these are her ancestors, and they came to my talk, I was so honored and so afraid of what they might think of the work, and they were incredibly kind and incredibly generous. And then this is an archivist, Deborah Davis, and this is Julie Boland, another friend and artist who works in Valdosta, who was really instrumental in sort of helping me make connections. So this is the book, Elegy for Mary Turner. It's a small book. You can get it from Verso Press. You can order it from Prairie Lights. And it's a hard read. I'll tell you, it's a hard read. But if you're interested in learning more about how those series of lynchings took place, and one of the things in the book that I really wanted to do, Walter White actually names the men who were involved in the lynchings. He has a list of about 15 men who were sort of the key players. And I also wrote their names in this book. And so I haven't heard anything from any of their families, but, he had quite good first person accounts that they were there and that they were present in what they did. And what's really interesting is, these men are powerful men. They are involved in churches. One runs a funeral parlor. One is like an executive of like Standard Oil. I mean, they're not, they're upstanding men. They're known in the community, and they felt that they could do this without, impunity, like they just did it and knew that nothing would happen. So this is the book I was actually working on when I came across the story of Mary Turner. And this is about a series of racial disturbances and violence that happened in 1943 in Detroit. And the thing that was really interesting about this story is all of the things leading up to the 3 days of sort of melee in the city of Detroit. So you had competition over jobs, especially, the auto industry retooled to sort of become a war machine. And Detroit was known as the arsenal of democracy. And so during that time in World War II, people didn't know that. A lot of people don't know this. I did not know this until I started doing research for this. There were all kinds of racial, riots, massacres, uprisings all over the country during World War II. It was an incredibly difficult time in our country in terms of, people seeking justice and saying, we're fighting overseas, but we have a Jim Crow system in our country happening. And in fact, if you've gotten a chance to read Caste by Isabella Wilkerson, she does this beautiful thing where she connects. She says, the Nazis basically patterned their violence on the Jim Crow South. And so the fact that, the United States is gearing up and fighting these people while not acknowledging the apartheid system we had in our own country really created incredible dissonance and strife and violence. And so, this is a moment when white people, especially in certain parts of the country, really felt like they were going to lose, their privileges. They were going to lose out if Black people in particular began to be seen as equal and treated equally. And so you had a lot of backlash. So these are some of the places that are well known for 1943: Newark, Los Angeles, Camp Stewart, Georgia, Beaumont, Camp Shenango, and Harlem. And for different reasons, they all start these, in recent years, these were called riots, but I would say that language has definitely changed in the past 2 or 3 years, and people are sort of thinking about them as rebellions, as massacres, as uprisings. So this page is one of the first pages, and I have this here. In this column, I took from the newspaper, and this is a list of people who were killed during the riots. And if you look here, most of the people that died were African American, and many of those, I think 17 out of those folks, were killed by police. And again, the stories of police brutality that were part of what happened in Detroit are sort of mind-blowing and shocking. The other thing I wanted to do in this book is really talk about women's roles and how they played a role in how labor changed, but also what was happening, in these 3 days in Detroit. When people wrote about Detroit, they wrote about it right after it happened. So like in the mid 40s, most of those people were journalists and sociologists. Most of them were white men and were really sort of, to some degree, caught up in the blame game. Who can we blame for this? Let's blame Black boys. Let's blame Southern people who've come to Detroit to make a better life. But very often women are invisible in all of those analyses. And again, the NAACP went in and took affidavits from people after, and even just on the tail end of the violence. And in those affidavits, many of them are from women, saying, a member of my family was involved in this. I don't know where they are. The police took them. The police shot them. I watched police harm people. So, what I did to sort of tell this story, at first I started just telling the story of the 3 days of violence in Detroit. And it starts on Belle Isle, which is this beautiful park off the coast in the river. And it's really hot. It's in the 90s. It's incredibly hot. People come together on a Sunday, or is it a Saturday or Sunday? I should know this. Anyway, on the weekend, and the island is just packed, and people are competing for space to just recreate. And as the sun goes down, people have been drinking, they're hot, there's a lot of scuffles, and most of these scuffles are interracial. And then all of a sudden there's a huge sort of rumble on the Belle Isle Bridge, and people that are involved in that are white sailors and young African Americans trying to leave, to get off the island, and white men and some women as well. And as a result of that, those groups go back to their communities and they spread all of these rumors about what happened on Belle Isle. One is that a Black woman and her baby were thrown off the bridge by white soldiers. Another one is that a white woman was with her boyfriend who was a white soldier and she was raped by Black youth. So these rumors stir up discontent and really unleash incredible violence. So prior to that, these things don't just happen. There was a lot going on in Detroit prior to that. So you've got the Battle of the Overpass happens. You've got the unions coming in and unionizing places like Ford Motor Company. You also have a history of racial unrest. So one of my favorite stories I found is about the Detroit Housewives League. And, there's a number of housewives leagues, but the Detroit Black Housewives League decided, we're going to boycott white businesses. We want people to buy their goods and services from Black businesses. And they find out that meat is sort of a sticking point, and that people in the Black community are basically being charged far more for the meat they have to buy than people in the white community. So, and I'm simplifying the story a great deal, but they end up torching. These are Black housewives that meet for a junior league, sort of torching a warehouse, to raise hell about this. So you've got some really powerful activist women in Detroit, and white women as well, not just Black women, but white women as well. The other thing that was happening is sort of how Black people were being seen as, patriotic during this time. There's always been issues around that, but at this point in time, the armed services are really starting to face pressure to fully integrate, not like, white people can do these jobs and we want Black people to do low level, awful service jobs. And so that was another, story that's threaded through this book. This is a bit, I read this transcript from a woman who was a nurse during World War II, and she was Black, and she was sent to, I think, Australia. And she encountered white soldiers there who thought maybe that Black people had tails, so this is this kind of like, she's sort of laughing about this, but not. And she also complained because her partner, was in the armed services, but he was working as a stevedore, which is really hard and miserable work. And he didn't see that as crucial work in terms of like fighting. So those are some stories. So the other thing that's happening is you suddenly have Black people getting jobs that are competitive with jobs that white people are holding in, the arsenal of democracy. And so you have a number of Wildcat Strikes where white people walk off the job to protest the fact that they have to work next to a Black person, whether that person's a woman or a man. And Black women were really just starting to break into the labor market. There's a whole idea around white women sort of becoming the backbone of the workforce during World War II. Black women wanted to do that. Those opportunities were very, very limited for them because of their race. So all this is happening in Detroit before, all hell breaks loose. And, Life magazine, this is from 1942, almost 1 year before this happened, says that something's going to happen in Detroit. There's going to be a riot. People are going to die. Someone has got to do something. And the mayor, Edward Jeffries, was kind of a wet blanket in this. He was like, well, I think it's fine. Everything's fine. He just sort of stuck his head in the sand. And as a result, when the violence broke out, he was kind of didn't know what to do. There was a real lack of, you almost see city leaders and state leaders running around saying, oh, should we declare martial law? What should we do? We need help. No, we don't need help. And so in my mind, when I saw the insurrection happen in January 6th, and people are like, where, who's coming to help? And no one showed up. And then it comes out that like people were lined up to help. They didn't know how to call them in. They were afraid more violence would ensue. This is a very similar story to what happened in Detroit. So here's just some pages. These are the affidavits of two women who were looking for one is looking for her brother. Her brother's arrested in Belle Isle. That she calls around to different police stations. They give her the runaround. She can't find where he is, and he doesn't come home. So she's absolutely terrified. And the same thing is true for this woman who's a mother looking for her son. So Robert Parsons is one young man, and Robert Gordon is the other. And this is his sister, and this is his mother. And they go all over Detroit, calling hospitals, calling jails, trying to figure out where these two men are, and they cannot find them. They finally do find them, but it's too late to help them, and they end up being sentenced to court. So, Detroit's also an incredible case study for rumors, and this is kind of how I ran across the Mary Turner story. So there's a lot of history of different kinds of rumors that sort of crop up in all of these disturbances over and over again. So, and then this is just a page sort of showing Belle Isle, people picnicking. These are some other pages. There was incredible hate speech going on. This is Robert Coughlin, who was sort of a radio talk show host, and he was just horrible in terms of white supremacy, horrible in terms of saying, Hitler is doing the work of God. I mean, there was a lot of hate speech going on. So, very similar when we think about talk show radio and the role that the media is playing now in sort of polarization. That same thing was true in Detroit. Here's another page. This is with Belle Isle. And Belle Isle was called, one of the things I really wanted to do about Detroit is get a sense of place. And so I made several visits, and Detroit's a wonderful city to visit. I would urge people to go. This is a shot from Belle Isle. Belle Isle is beautiful in its day. Since then, the city really doesn't have the money to maintain it in the way that it used to be maintained. And obviously, there's a lot of urban blight in Detroit. The other thing that was interesting about doing this book is many of the places, much of the violence happens in a place called Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, which was sort of the area that Black people had been confined to in terms of housing. And, we can talk, redlining is another thing I talk about in this book. And much of that is gone now because they sort of did urban renewal and highways came through and they just wiped out huge parts of town. But there's a wonderful architectural designer who found a whole cache of photographs from that area and has put them together to show sort of block by block what that area looked like. And I drew heavily on those. So again, the archives were an amazing place for me as an artist. These are the different archives I went to. I spent a lot of time at Wayne State in the labor archives. This is the museum, I think of it as a museum, the Detroit Public Library. Amazing and beautiful place. And they had, they're really a site that a lot of people interested in genealogy go to, but this is where the letters to the mayor were kept. So I had the mayor's archives were there. And so I spent a few days reading all the letters he received around these issues prior to the uprising and then after. And that was one of my favorite places to spend time. I love that place. It's beautiful. Also, they have an amazing collection of comics. This is the archive at the University of Michigan. This is the African American Museum in Detroit. It's right across the street from Wayne State. And then this is the Detroit Free Press. And as you know, newspapers are really changing. They're much more digital than they used to be. And I went there and said, hey, have you got any pictures of the uprising in Detroit, those 3 days in June? And there was a woman bored out of her mind who was in charge of the photo archives there. And she was like, please come in. She gave me access to all of these newspaper photos from that period of time. It was fascinating because I got to see where there was white out, where they cropped them. And she said, whatever you need, I'll make copies of. So that was also incredibly helpful. I could not have done this book without the photos from the press. And so here's some primary documents. And you can see, they're using the language of riot, but it really was not necessarily a riot. You had a lot of white violence on Black people. So I use this image. A lot of people in Detroit didn't know what was going on Monday morning when they woke up. You know, they didn't have the internet. They had the news. Some people watched, some people read, but some people didn't. And they, you know, this was all happening in a small area of Detroit, and life went on. So I always think about in Iowa City when the flood happened, you know, and there are parts of Iowa City that were really affected by the flood, but in other parts of Iowa City, life was just going on. You know, people were going to work, doing their thing. And so the same thing is true in Detroit. So a number of people ended up getting on streetcars to go downtown to work. And lo and behold, they're pulled off the streetcars by white mobs and chased and beaten. But these primary documents were really important. Here's another one. These are just images from that day. A lot of cars burned. This was all up and down Woodward Avenue, which is a big thoroughfare, was in Detroit. And then eventually the military, the state police and the National Guard come in and take over, and they stayed through July. And then I read everything I could find about these particular events. And then this is sort of how I laid it out. People are like, well, how did you do this? This is what my notebook looked like, you know? So here, this is me planning panels and thinking about what quotes, you know, what's a thought bubble, what's a word, you know, what's a direct quote, you know, how do I want to think about narration? So these are sort of what my notebooks look like. This is me sort of laying out the chronology here. And I have, you know, a couple of these. They were super precious. And this is just sort of my desk. And it was super low tech. You know, I just worked on watercolor paper. I worked with pen and ink and a lot of pencil, and just drew and drew and drew. And it took me almost 13 years to do this book, which is crazy. And I don't know what that says about me. I'm not sure that's good. So this is a stack of the drawings I did. And this is my dad's Bible. And I just put this next to it just for comparison so you can see. And then the thing you can't see is I ended up doing a lot of things digitally because finally technology, the iPad technology, you know, caught up with my aesthetic as an artist. When I first started, I was like, I cannot draw on a computer. And then finally, I got a really nice iPad a couple of years ago, and I was like, I can draw on a computer now. It looks just like drawing on paper. And it even, you know, the program I use makes the same sound as drawing on paper. So it's sort of like, I could do this. What you don't see here are all the digital drawings. And then this is the book that finally came out, and it was published by UNC Press. And again, you can get this at Prairie Lights. They've got it. I think Daydreams will order it for you if you're interested. And you can get it through Amazon. But UNC Press will be better and cheaper, and so will Prairie Lights. So I hope you'll buy the book.